what's likely to happen in the years ahead, I think a good place to start is with the expectations of the masters of the world, the expectations of the powerful. What do they anticipate? And I think the Middle East should be viewed within that context. Actually, they've helped us out on that. There is an interesting study, which I'd urge you to read if you haven't, published by the U.S. National Intelligence Council. That's the CIA and the other intelligence agencies. Publication was put together jointly with representatives of the business world and the academic profession. Came out pre-September 11th, but nothing much has changed in that respect. It's called Global Trends 2015, so they're projecting what they expect to happen for the next 15 years. The main prediction is that what they call globalization will continue on course. I'm quoting, "Its evolution will be rocky, marked by chronic financial volatility and a widening economic divide." That's the basic prediction. Those of you who take economics courses know that in theory, globalization is supposed to lead to a single market, an integrated market with a common price and wage. So what they're actually predicting is less globalization in a technical sense, that is a widening economic divide, but more globalization in the doctrinally preferred sense, which means that the people who matter will do just fine, and the rest, it's not our department. That's widening economic divide. Financial volatility means slower growth, harming mostly the poor. That's their what they call their most optimistic projection. Well, that projection actually extends previous tendencies. The so-called neoliberal period, the period that's sometimes called globalization, the term doesn't mean much, the last 25 years or so, have been marked by a very notable deterioration in almost every aspect of economic development, growth of economies, of productivity, of investment, even growth of trade. And that's true pretty much worldwide, the United States and almost everywhere else, the only real exceptions being the countries that didn't follow the rules. And so they're predicting that's going to continue. The military planners make pretty much the same predictions. So Clinton-era planners also published expectations of the future. This one, there are many, but this was the most interesting one. Is called Visions for 2020. It's actually meant for the public, so you should look at it. Visions for 2020. They predict a growing gap between the haves and the have-nots. And they predict that the have-nots will become disruptive, and it'll be necessary to control them in the interests of what's called stability. Stability is a technical term that means everybody follows orders. You can have perfect stability, but if they're not following orders, you have to get rid of it, destabilize it in the interest of stability. Actually, I'm quoting, but believe it or not. As that's described by the National Intelligence Council, the same prediction, they say that as globalization proceeds, deepening stagnation will foster political, ethnic, ideological, and religious extremism, along with violence, much of it directed against the United States. Okay, so that's the anticipation from the success of what they call globalization. That's part of the motive, a good part of the motive between the vast expansion of U.S. military power. Even before September 11th, the U.S. vastly outspent any conceivable collection of adversaries and allies, and the figures are misleading because it does not count other things. For example, the United States has an offshore military base in the Middle East called Israel, which there in Israel they call it, recently there's a very good military correspondent in the mainstream right-wing newspaper reporting the views of the military, described Israel as not a state with a military, but a military with a state. And the military is actually a branch of the U.S. military, so that's probably the way to look at it. Since it's a small country, but since it's basically has become essentially a U.S. military base, it has a very powerful military force, which is not counted in U.S. military strength, though it should be. And it's not small. They estimate that their own air and naval forces are larger and more technologically advanced than any NATO power outside the United States. And the same is true of their armored forces. Britain, which theoretically is called an independent country, approximately in the sense in which Ukraine was independent under the Soviet Union, that's the major military force in NATO outside the United States. So we have the United States, Israel, Britain. 40 years ago, a senior Kennedy advisor described Britain as our lieutenant. The fashionable word is partner. The British like to hear the fashionable word, but it's nice to know the way they're thought of internally. Well, all of this is really part of the U.S. military. So yes, it's enormous. September 11th was used as a pretext for rapid expansion of military spending, and a pretext. I mean, the spending has essentially nothing to do with the threat of terrorism, just as the military doesn't. So the military, the plan is to, and in fact reality, to make the United States so overwhelmingly dominant that is in a place of world control without challenge. The president's recent national security strategy sort of spelled this out rather starkly, and it goes way back. Going back to the vision for 2020, the Clinton era document, this happens to come from the Space Command, but it's general. They give a historical survey explaining why this has to happen, and it's pretty accurate. They say in the past, countries like the United States had to develop armies for self-defense. We needed an army for self-defense as the U.S. was taking over the national territory. That was self-defense against what the Declaration of Independence calls the merciless Indian savages who were brutally attacking the innocent colonists who just wanted to live in peace and had no other thoughts in mind. And you needed an army in self-defense until the national territory was conquered. Countries also established navies, later air forces, in order, I'm quoting it now, in order to protect commercial interests and investments. Of course, Britain was in the lead back in the old days, but when Britain developed the Navy to protect its global interests and investments, incidentally funding the Navy from the greatest narco-trafficking enterprise in human history. That's a large part of the history of empire, involves the conquest of India and the break into China. It was really extraordinary. But they did have the Navy, thanks to narco-trafficking primarily. But it could be countered by others. So Germany could construct a Navy to counter the British Navy with consequences in the 20th century we don't have to talk about. But the Clinton planners point out that this time it's going to be different. The U.S. is going to have such overwhelming power that there will be no counterforce. And in particular, that's going to be true of what they call the next frontier, namely the militarization of space, which is what they're specifically interested in. And they say that is necessary to protect U.S. interests, markets, and investments, and of course to control the growing number of have-nots. As the globalization proceeds, with deepening stagnation and a widening economic divide, which is going to foster extremism, violence, So we'll therefore need what's going to be called, as it has been for the last 20 years, a war on terror. And anyone who has a good University of Pennsylvania education knows that when you hear the phrase war on terror, you mean terrorist war, which is exactly what it's been for 20 years, including the new phase that was redeclared on September 11th. Well, those are the most ominous part of these general projections actually has to do with militarization of space. It's not talked about much, but it's very critical. This is still Clinton-era planning. It's been escalated by Bush. The idea is to put highly destructive weapons in space, probably nuclear-powered. They got to be on hair-trigger alert, automated, which raises a very high probability of what's called in the trade normal accidents. Normal accidents are the accidents that unpredictably take place in any complex system. So if you have a computer, you know about normal accidents. Just things happen in complicated systems which are unpredictable. When a normal accident takes place under militarization of space, you can say goodbye to your friends and children and people overseas and so on, because that'll probably be the last act. But that's the plan. And it requires violating another treaty, which isn't talked about much, the Outer Space Treaty of 1967. Although it isn't discussed much here, it's well known around the world. The UN General Assembly has, for the last couple of years, brought up the Outer Space Treaty, which has so far been observed. They've brought it up for ratification, just reaffirmation. The U.S. doesn't vote against it, it abstains. It's passed unanimously with the U.S. and Israel abstaining, I think once, maybe Micronesia. The UN Disarmament Committee has been meeting through the last couple of years, and the major focus of it is to try to ban expansion of military development into space. That's been pressed by just about everybody. The U.S. has been blocking it consistently, so nothing has happened. And the reasons are the background ones I've just described. This total silence about this, read nothing about it. I guess the reasoning in the editorial offices is it's not a good idea to let citizens know of plans that may bring to an end biology's only experiment with higher intelligence. A lot of this is concealed as missile defense, but again, when you hear the word defense, you interpret it as offense, and that's the way it's understood by planners. So, for example, the RAND Corporation, which is the main sort of analytic and advisory research agency, more or less, for the Pentagon, and the RAND Corporation's reports on missile defense happen to be almost verbatim the same as the pronouncements of the Chinese government protesting missile defense. Both of them say in almost the same words that, quoting it, ballistic missile defense is not simply a shield, but rather an enabler of U.S. actions. That is, it provides the U.S. with the security that enables it to use its military forces anywhere without any concern for retaliation, even by those who have weapons of mass destruction. It's not going to work, but that's another story, talking about their thinking. Missile defense is supposed to, I'm quoting now, provide the United States with absolute freedom in using or threatening to use force in international relations, cementing U.S. hegemony, and making Americans the masters of the world. I'm quoting military analysts in the conservative and liberal press. In the liberal press, like they point out that the liberals are wrong when they oppose ballistic missile defense. They've got matters backwards. They should be in favor of it because it's going to enable the U.S. to use military force without any concern, and that'll enable the U.S. to carry out the humanitarian intervention everywhere that liberals are in favor of. And the logic, so therefore they'd be in favor of missile defense and a huge military buildup and weapons in space and everything else. Which the logic is completely impeccable as long as you accept the basic principle of religious doctrine, namely that anything the United States does uniquely in history and uniquely in the current word is benevolent. If you accept the fundamental theological principle, everything else follows. And that one can't be questioned. If you raise a question about that, you're labeled as someone who hates America or some other insult. That's the reasoning behind the long-term global planning that was recently announced. It's true that the current administration takes an extreme position on the spectrum, but you have to bear in mind that it's a pretty narrow spectrum. That's why I was quoting Clinton-era documents. There's a lot more to say about the general topic, but let's focus now on the Middle East, which I think should be thought of. Planning for that should be thought of within this more general framework. So the National Intelligence Council projections do, of course, talk about the Middle East. They say that regional demand for energy will increase sharply. Middle East, the main source of hydrocarbon energy. They point out that's going to undermine the Kyoto protocols and lead to more rapid global warming. It's another threat to human survival, but entirely rational within a kind of lunatic framework. They go on to say that the Persian Gulf region will see large increases in oil production capacity and will rise in importance to world energy markets. And it therefore follows that the U.S. must control them. As has been the case since World War II, about the time I was a student here, in fact, and talking about it, that's the time when the United States kicked France out of the Middle East and reduced Britain to a junior partner and essentially took over. They also point out that the United States itself will not rely on Middle East oil, rather on more secure sources, many of them primarily in the Western Hemisphere. But that's been true since World War II. It's not that the U.S. needs Saudi oil. Get along without it fine. Just looking at the last 60 years, until about 1970, North America was the major oil producer and exporter. And since that time, the major importer to the U.S. has often been Venezuela. Either it's first or somewhere close, and there are others that have nothing to do with the Gulf. But that has nothing to do with the need to control the major energy reserves of the world. In fact, if the U.S. was running on a hydrogen economy or, solar energy, they'd still want to control it for other reasons. And they were discussed in the 40s, in what were then secret and are now public documents. The State Department described the Persian Gulf region as the greatest material prize in world history and a stupendous source of strategic power, as one of the standard histories of the oil industry later says. It yielded profits beyond dreams of avarice, and those profits have to come back here, either directly to U.S. corporations, not necessarily energy corporations. It can be construction firms and things like that, or right into the U.S. Treasury. It has to flow back here, mostly. It also, the strategic power is very significant. It provides what planners in the late 40s called veto power. It's George Kennan, off at the humanist end. Veto power, control over energy provides veto power over others. We have a stranglehold over them. If they go the wrong way, strangle them. It's kind of like the IMF. Just make sure they do the right thing. And you don't want to lose the veto power. It's a lever of world control. So quite apart from any access to oil, which is what is talked about a lot, this stupendous source of strategic power and the greatest material prize in world history has to be essentially in U.S. hands. That's taken for granted. Well, how do you do it? There was a framework in place when the U.S. took over, namely the British framework. The British had, since the First World War, when oil became a big issue, the British controlled the region with what they called an Arab facade, that is, weak, pliable states, which would be a facade behind which the British would in fact rule. The facade, British control, they said, would be veiled by constitutional fictions as protectorates, spheres of influence, buffer states, and so on. I'm quoting Lord Curzon during the First World War, but it was general. And the idea is that that's a lot more cost-effective than direct rule. Also, at the end of the First World War, air power was just coming along, and it was recognized right away that air power is more cost-effective than ground forces. It's a lot easier to massacre civilians with the RAF than to send troops chasing around on the ground, something we know too. That explains why Winston Churchill was so enthusiastic about the use of poison gas against what he called uncivilized tribes. And he condemned he was Secretary of State in the War and Colonial Office. He condemned the squeamishness of those who are raising doubts about using what was then the most criminal weapon of war, which he said would spread a lively terror among the uncivilized tribes chafing under British rule. Recalcitrant Arabs, as they were called by the British, mostly Kurds and Afghans at that time. Bush is supposed to have a bust of Winston Churchill given them as a gift by Tony Blair very prominently on his desk, and I presume this would be a good reason for it. Murderous bombing of civilians was also justified by the British on the same grounds, and it was pretty brutal, mostly in those areas. The British also found it necessary, quite reasonably, to undermine international conventions. You remember this period between the two world wars. There were many attempts to introduce disarmament conventions and try to move towards peace. People were very upset about the First World War, but the British consistently undermined them because they would put barriers in the way of the British use of criminal violence against uncivilized tribes. They established a precedent for their successor. And the reasons were frankly stated, even though internally. So in 1932, the British did manage to undermine an international convention that would have blocked the use of air power against defenseless civilians. And the distinguished statesman Lloyd George wrote secretly at the time that this was a good thing because we have to reserve the right to bomb niggers, which is a fundamental moral principle, and such principles have a very long lifetime. Yes, you got to reserve the right to bomb niggers, and that's sacrosanct. And the U.S., of course, just takes over and continues it. The United States took over the British framework, essentially intact, but extended it. It added another layer of control, regional powers, which would protect the facade from unruly populations. The uncivilized tribes don't understand. They're backward and stupid, and they've never been able to get it through their heads that the wealth of the region has to flow to the west with a rake-off to local elites instead of going to them. And until they understand that, we're just going to have to bomb the niggers. I mean, there isn't much else you can do. And the regional powers, regional military powers, are supposed to protect the facade, and if anything is really needed, then the U.S. and Britain step in with the real muscle. These regional powers were called local cops on the beat by the Nixon administration. Understanding is that headquarters is in Washington and branch offices in London. Among the regional cops are supposed to be non-Arab. They apparently do a better job killing Arabs. So Turkey was always central. It's the major military force in the region. Iran, as long as it was under the Shah. And in fact, U.S., Israel, and Pakistan now and then, U.S.-Israel relations developed precisely in that context. In 1948, the U.S. Joint Chiefs of Staff were quite impressed by Israel's military prowess. and ranked it second to Turkey in the region as a military force, observing that potentially this could be useful for the U.S. system of control of the uncivilized tribes. In 1958, which was a crucial year, the U.S. intelligence concluded that, quoting it, a logical corollary of U.S. opposition to Arab nationalism would be support for Israel as the only reliable base for U.S. power in the region. They didn't really act on that at the time, but they did in 1967. In 1967, Israel performed a major service to the United States. It destroyed the center of secular Arab nationalism, Nasser's Egypt, which was also one of the main centers of the despised non-aligned movement. And that was a great achievement, and that's what led to the love affair between American intellectuals and Israel and the huge alliance that developed and so on. It was a significant achievement, and it sort of continues from there. We should, when talking about these things, remember that the United States is a global power. We mislead ourselves by looking too narrowly at some particular part of the world. Quite commonly, the same things or similar things are happening everywhere, and this is no exception. Another major center of the non-aligned movement, and also incidentally an oil producer, was Indonesia. And in 1965, a U.S.-backed military coup eliminated a second center of the non-aligned movement by overthrowing the Indonesian government in what the New York Times accurately described as a staggering mass slaughter, killing maybe 1 million people, mostly landless peasants. The CIA described it as one of the great mass murders of the 20th century, compared it to Hitler, Stalin, and Mao. It was greeted with complete euphoria in the United States. The facts were, and most of the West, incidentally, the facts were known, like they weren't secret, but it was just overjoyed at this enormous mass slaughter, like Hitler and Stalin. And the main reason was that it undermined the threat of Indonesian democracy, which had been a big problem, and also destroyed a center of the non-aligned movement. The main target of the attack was the only mass-based political party in the country, basically a party of poor peasants, and that was just totally wiped out. And that's another achievement comparable to destroying Nasser. Actually, this had been going on for a while. In 1958, the United States carried out the major clandestine operation of post-war history, at least short of Nicaragua, in an effort to overthrow the government of Indonesia by supporting a rebellion of generals who were the idea was they would cut off the outer islands where all the resources are. And the main threat there too was democracy. The Party of the Poor, the PKI, was gaining in political power. They were afraid it might win the next election, and therefore it would have to be eliminated. It's pointed out in internal documents. Well, that didn't work in 1958. The U.S. then turned to support for the Indonesian generals, and that paid off in 1965 with the staggering mass slaughter. In fact, Kennedy intellectuals testifying at Congress, McNamara in this case, when asked by Congress whether it made sense to support Indonesian military during the period of hostility between the U.S. and Indonesia, he said, yes, it definitely made sense, and in his words, it paid dividends, about 1 million corpses at that time. Well, that was Indonesia, comparable to Nasser, though different agencies. In 1958, as I mentioned, a major year in modern history, the U.S. faced 3 crises. Incidentally, we have a rich documentary record on this, internal, very revealing, which I guess is why nobody ever talks about it. There were 3 crises the Eisenhower administration identified, all of them oil producers, all of them Islamic, though at that time secular Islamic, Indonesia, North Africa, Middle East. Those were the 3 crises. Eisenhower and his Secretary of State, Dulles, insisted strenuously that the Russians were not involved in any of them. The problem was independent nationalism and too much democracy. Actually, if you take a look at the record of the Cold War, that's pretty typical. For the public, it's the Russians are coming or something like that. But if you look at the cases, it's usually independent nationalism. And that's true of the 1958 crises. Well, in the North African crisis was overcome when Algeria gained independence. Israel took care of Nasser. General Suharto restored Indonesia. The U.S. control undermined any threat of democracy, so it was a big success. Well, returning to the Middle East, as I mentioned, U.S. relations with Israel developed in this context and continued to. In 1979, the Shah was overthrown, one of the local Copts was gone, so the U.S. relation with Israel became even more significant. By now, it's just become a U.S. military base. It's part of what the Egyptian press sometimes calls the axis of evil, namely U.S., Turkey, Israel. About over 10% of Israel's air and naval forces are reported to be permanently based in Turkey. Also the armored forces, which are going to be needed. They fear if Turkey has to return to its slaughter of and destruction of the Kurdish population of southeastern Turkey. That's some of the most grisly atrocities of the 1990s, but since it was almost totally funded and backed by the United States, basically unmentionable. You can take a look at this morning's New York Times for typical evasion. And they're going to be there in case they have to do that again, as they might after an Iraqi war. Israeli Air Force is based in the U.S. bases in eastern Turkey. U.S. has huge bases there, where planes fly, probably nuclear armed. Apparently, the Israeli Air Force is mostly flying aimed at Iran. It's flying across the Iranian border. They're looking a step beyond the conquest of Iraq to the next one. And according to U.S. specialists in the region, there already are efforts underway effectively to partition Iran, to take the northern part where a lot of the oil is and transfer it over to Azerbaijan, extending the axis of evil from U.S., Israel, and Turkey to Azerbaijan, a small player but useful. Includes now India, which is under a right-wing extremist nationalist government and therefore can enter into the axis, and Pakistan's an uneasy partner. Iran is a big target down the road, Syria along the way, and all of this is part of the big plans for reorganizing the Middle East. It's primarily for these reasons, I think, that the United States has blocked any diplomatic settlement of the Arab-Israeli conflict for the past 30 years. I won't run through the details of that, but they're revealing just high points, or maybe low points. In 1971, Egypt offered a complete peace settlement, exactly in accord with U.S. policy, offering nothing to the Palestinians. The U.S. thought about it, but turned it down, preferring what Henry Kissinger called stalemate. No negotiations, just force. That led directly to the 1973 war, which point it was realized that Egypt isn't a basket case. Can't just laugh at it. At that point, the United States moved into shuttle diplomacy, ultimately ending up in the Camp David agreements of 78, 79, which essentially accepted the Egyptian proposal of 1971, although by then, Sadat was calling for Palestinian national rights, so it was a less favorable agreement than the one offered and rejected in 1971. But when you read about this, it's described as a triumph of U.S. diplomacy. And that's necessary because, remember, it must be that everything the United States does is benign and right and wonderful and so on. So therefore, this colossal failure, which almost led to a nuclear war in 73, appears in history as a triumph of U.S. diplomacy, a high point of the so-called peace process. Pretty familiar way of reading history. It was understood right away that the peace agreement with Egypt, that is Israel's withdrawal from Egyptian territory and elimination of Egypt from the conflict, removed the only Arab deterrent. Therefore, as Israeli strategic analysts pointed out right away, Israel would now be free to attack its northern neighbor and to move to settle and integrate the occupied territories within Israel with a huge increase in U.S. military aid. So it's a U.S. Israeli policy, which is exactly what happened. The settlement and development in the occupied territories rapidly increased, U.S. taxpayer paying for it, and Israel began to attack Lebanon. 1978 and more severely 1982. None of this had anything to do with self-defense, nothing. The Israeli chief of staff in 1982, Rafael Eitan, was just expressing common understanding when he described the 1982 invasion as a success because it destroyed the PLO as a candidate with negotiations with us about the land of Israel. And that's what it was about. It was an effort to undercut the threat of diplomacy by destroying the Palestinian organization that was calling for a political settlement. That was pretty frank and open in Israel. It left 20,000 corpses, which was quite a triumph for Reagan and Sharon, and incidentally a textbook illustration of international terrorism, if not the worst crime of aggression. Well, in 1976, the U.S. became more isolated. It was compelled to veto a Security Council resolution calling for a political settlement on what has been a very broad international consensus ever since then, two-state settlement on the internationally recognized border, recognized by the U.S. too. Israel was opposed to it. It reacted to the UN meeting by bombing Lebanon, killing around 50 civilians. Now, this was reported, but no comment. It's not terrorism by definition because Israel's a U.S. client state. So you want to kill 50 people to show your anger at the UN. That's perfectly normal. Israel's UN ambassador, Chaim Herzog, considered a dove, later president, according to him, the resolution at the Security Council was prepared by the PLO, which is totally false, but even though they did publicly support it, but even though false, it indicates the passion of U.S.-Israel fear of political settlement in accord with the international consensus. Well, the U.S. vetoed that one and vetoed it again under Carter in 1980. Notice that a U.S. veto is a double veto. For one thing, the policy is vetoed, but secondly, it's vetoed from history. Okay, so it's actually a very crucial double veto. You won't find anything about this unless you really search hard. There's a lot of, that's the prerogatives of power, especially when you have a subservient, educated class, which is willing to go along with anything. There's a lot of talk now about the Iraqi violation of UN resolutions, which is quite true. They're in violation of all sorts of resolutions. Sometimes it's pointed out that Israel is in violation of even more resolutions, which is also true. But what is not pointed out is something quite significant. One way to undermine UN resolutions is to veto. If Iraq was able to veto Security Council resolutions, it wouldn't be in violation of any resolutions, obviously. So if you want to talk seriously about violation of UN resolutions, you have to bring in the veto, which turns out to be an overwhelming factor. And ever since decolonization, around the 1960s, when the UN became somewhat more representative of the world, ever since then, the U.S. is far in the lead in vetoing resolutions on a whole variety of issues. In second place is Britain, and a very distant third are France and Russia, and China doesn't exist. So that's the actual, those are the actual facts about defiance of UN Security Council resolutions, and any serious discussion of the matter would highlight this. You can judge how much it's discussed. Well, in the following years, without going through the details, there were more initiatives from the PLO, from the Arab states, from Europe. They were all blocked by the United States. Almost all of this was suppressed or often denied in public commentary, and that goes on right to the present. So early this year, there was a lot of fuss about what's called the Saudi Plan, which was ratified by the Arab League last March, and that was considered a big breakthrough. In fact, it's virtually identical to the Saudi Plan of 20 years earlier. And some of the press, the better press, noticed that, so the Wall Street Journal pointed that out, but then claimed falsely that the 1981 plan was undermined by the Arab states. In fact, it was undermined by the United States and Israel, as usual. But to say that would be going a little too far. And the Saudi plan itself was just a variant of the 1976 Security Council resolution that the U.S. had vetoed. And that it's interesting that public opinion in the United States, a large majority, around 2/3, are in favor of the Saudi plan, which is the long-standing international consensus. And approximately the same portion of the population thinks the United States ought to become more involved in the peace process. And almost nobody knows that that's a self-contradiction. You know, it's the U.S. which has been blocking it for 25 years. So for the U.S. to become more involved is just to continue to block it. But to know those elementary facts of modern history, you have to, be acquainted with what has actually happened. And that's not allowed. We have many effective barriers against that danger. So people don't know that their positions are contradictory. Well, Clinton came along, and he essentially rescinded international law and all UN resolutions, which his administration described as obsolete and anachronistic, so we can forget those. Then comes the Oslo peace process, which changed the modalities, but not the concept. The basic character of the Oslo peace process was described quite accurately by a leading Israeli dove, Shlomo ben Ami, who was Ehud Barak's chief negotiator at Camp David, the dovish government, the Camp David thing. And just before, he's an academic historian, just before joining the Barak government, he wrote a book in Hebrew about these things in which he described the Oslo process. And he said the goal of the Oslo process is to establish a permanent neo-colonial dependency for the Palestinians. And that's correct. The idea is to make it kind of like the South African Bantustans, permanent neo-colonial dependency. And if you look at what went on, that's what the policies were directed to. The offers made by Barak and Clinton at Camp David were praised here just, as magnanimous and generous and amazing, and the Palestinians have been denounced for not accepting them. If you look at a map, you can see that this is radically false, although it's true that Clinton and Barak did make some progress. At the time of Camp David, the Palestinians in the West Bank were divided into over 200 isolated little areas, some a couple of square kilometers in size. And Barak and Clinton progressed. They wanted to break it into 4 separated cantons in the West Bank, 3, a northern and a central, and a southern one broken up by Israeli settlement and infrastructure, all of them separated from a little part of East Jerusalem, which is the center of Palestinian commercial and cultural life, and it's separated from the 3 cantons, and all, of course, separated from Gaza, so 5, and the fate of Gaza was uncertain. So that was progress, from over 200 just down to 4, and they should be praised for that. There's a very easy way to determine whether this is correct, namely just look at a map. The best way to evaluate the magnanimity and generosity of the offer is to look at the map that was proposed. And you'll have to work hard to do that. As far as I can discover, not a single map was ever published in the mainstream of the United States. You could find it in the standard reference sources and in the dissident literature, and you could find it in the Israeli press. But nobody's been able to find a map here during the period when this tremendous praise for Clinton's magnanimity and so on was all over the front pages. Well, I think there's a pretty obvious reason for that, but I leave it to you to figure it out. Under the cover of, and that takes a lot of discipline for the entire press to realize you better not publish the one way in which anyone can evaluate these claims. That, again, is impressive discipline. I don't know if you could achieve it in a totalitarian state. Well, under the cover of Oslo, under the cover of, and there's no force, remember. This is voluntary. Nobody's putting any pressure on them. Under the cover of Oslo, the U.S. and Israel continued to institute the neocolonial dependency in the territories. The settlement approximately doubled. The idea was to construct two salients, one extending east of Jerusalem, including the town of Adumim, which was established basically to partition the West Bank, and another northern salient, which breaks up the area to the north. And that's part of the magnanimous proposal. And the harsh and brutal repression, which is now in its 36th year, that continued. There's an article on the front page of the New York Times today, some headline like, sorrowful Israeli, controls Nablus or something. That's a quote from a line which is ridiculed by anyone with their eyes open in Israel. It translates in English as shooting and crying. We shoot and cry. We kill the children, but we cry about it because we're such humanists. So therefore, it's a sorrowful Israeli colonel who's doing all these things. And he says he's driving, the Palestinians are going back to 20 years ago. But the Times doesn't tell us what it was like 20 years ago. You can find that out from the Israeli press or the dissident literature here, which quotes it. That was the time when leading Israeli scholars were pointing, and military analysts were pointing out that critically that 20 years ago that by then 750,000 young Israelis in the army had learned that their task is to demolish the rights of innocent people because they are Arabushim. It's the Hebrew slang, which means basically niggers. They are Arabushim living in territories that God promised to us. And that's correct. That happened to be a period 20 years ago, which the Israeli colonel, sorrowful colonel, certainly knows, of heightened repression and violence by the army and settlers, which actually broke through to the mainstream because it was so ugly. But at that time, Israel still had immunity from any retaliation from within the territories. So therefore, it was okay. Nobody cared. And the same goes right up through the present Intifada. As recently, and it turns out that in the first days of early October 2000, the Israeli army has just released the fact that in the first days of the Intifada, the army fired 1 million bullets. One high officer said that's 1 bullet for every child. There was no threats, the ratio of killings in the first couple of weeks was like 20-1 or something, and nothing happening inside Israel. But that was considered just fine here. That's the way it's supposed to be. That's the way you treat the Arabushim. Remember, we have to reserve the right to bomb the niggers. And if they raise their heads, you got to teach them how to behave. And it has to be with overwhelming force because we have overwhelming force. And it's all right and good because of the principle that we are righteous. After all, we learned that from kindergarten. Doesn't matter what the facts are. There was some progress after Camp David, namely at Taba in January 2001. There were negotiations. They were informal, but high level, Palestinian and Israeli, and they made advances beyond Taba. It still wasn't acceptable, still had the salients, but it was considerable progress, and it might have gotten somewhere. We can't tell. Barak, Israel pulled out of them, and we have a good record of it from a European Union commentator. I suspect that the reason, in order to go beyond that, it would be necessary for a functioning Palestinian administration to exist. And of course, in the months since, it's been totally wiped out. And it could be that the reason is to try to ensure that there is no threat of moving towards the negotiations, which we're getting somewhere, and we're hopeful, might have been a basis for a political settlement. Anyway, that's some reason to believe this, but no time to talk about it. Well, going on to George Bush, he carried the extreme U.S. rejectionist position further. A good illustration of that is the fate of the Fourth Geneva Convention. It's not much discussed here, but it's quite crucial. The Fourth Geneva Convention, if applied, would essentially end the story. It would declare illegal just about everything the U.S. and Israel are doing in the territories, and the violations of the Geneva Conventions are war crimes. Grave breaches are serious war crimes under U.S. law. The U.S. hasn't yet officially withdrawn from its position, which goes back to the late 60s, that the Geneva Conventions do apply in the occupied territories, and has not withdrawn its censure of Israel as the, quoting, occupying power. Happened to be quoting George Bush #1 at a time when he was a UN ambassador. In 1980, the Security Council unanimously condemned Israeli actions in the territories, mostly settlement, but others, as a flagrant violation of the Geneva Conventions, that is a serious war crime. In 1991, that was essentially repeated. The U.S. voted with the majority, which was totally hypocritical because the U.S. was funding the settlements that it was denouncing as a flagrant violation. October 2000, there was a change. This is Clinton, and international law has been rescinded as obsolete and anachronistic. The Security Council in October 2000, shortly after the Intifada broke out, once again condemned Israel as the occupying power for a flagrant violation of the conventions. At that time, the U.S. abstained. Presumably, Clinton didn't want to veto a core principle, maybe the core principle of international humanitarian law, particularly given the circumstances under which the laws were enacted. Remember that these conventions were established to criminalize formally the atrocities of the Nazis in occupied territories. The entire European Union came, including even England and almost all the others. They declared the acts taken in the occupied territories, including settlements, as a grave breach of the convention. It includes willful killing, torture, unlawful deportation, deprivation of right to a fair trial, destruction, appropriation of property, and so on. The U.S. boycotted the meeting, thereby exercising the standard double veto. Nothing happens, and no one knows about it. There's essentially no reporting. The high contracting parties, like the United States, have a legal obligation under the most solemn treaties to investigate, apprehend, and punish anyone responsible for these grave breaches, that is, war crimes. That includes the U.S. leadership. You know how well that requirement has been met. In fact, if anyone were to suggest it, they'd probably be sent to Guantanamo for permanent residence there without trial. The Israeli press, which is fairly reliable generally quite reliable about these things, I should say, especially the right-wing press, it now reports that Washington is informing Israeli leaders about plans to reconstruct the whole Middle East, beginning with Iraq, which might, they say, be restored to a Hashemite monarchy the British established, tied up with Jordan. And that, they say, will give Israel opportunities for what's called transfer. That's a euphemistic term for what we call ethnic cleansing, when people we don't like do it. So getting rid of the problem by the easy way under the framework of a war. One highly respected Israeli commentator, Ehud Sprinzak, coming back from meetings with officials in Washington, that's Defense Department officials like Rumsfeld and Cheney and so on, said, "We are talking about a revolutionary group. We can summarize their approach in one sentence. they think that Arabs are retards who understand only the language of force. Actually, that conforms pretty well to what we're observing in practice, but it's understated. It's not just the Arabs who are retards, so's anyone else. Just take a look at the way Germany was treated for daring to not follow orders on Iraq. They're retards too, and so is anybody that doesn't get the point, and with overwhelming resources of violence at your command and very little internal criticism, maybe on tactical grounds, but nothing principled, with a obedient intellectual class, it's assumed you can get away with quite a lot. The next step is the invasion of Iraq, presumably over the winter. Can't wait until the next winter because then it'll interfere with the presidential election. The British just put out a dossier of Iraq's crimes, which are indeed a hideous record, gassing civilians and all the rest. And as usual, they just omitted the usual 3 words, with our help. Yeah, all these atrocities took place with our help because we thought they were just fine. Britain and the United States continued to support their friend Saddam, continued right after Halabja and everything else, continued to provide him with the means for developing weapons of mass destruction, biological, chemical, and nuclear missiles, in fact, and did this right up till the day when he committed his first crime, namely he disobeyed orders on August 2nd, 1990, and instead of just rectifying the border with Kuwait, as he thought he was authorized to do, he went too far. The pretext, but there are really substantial reasons for the invasion. The obvious one is oil. Iraq has the 2nd largest oil reserves in the world. It's been obvious all along. The U.S. is going to find some way to regain control of that. That's important. Would enable the U.S. to essentially break up OPEC, to set prices and production levels within the range that it wants, not too high, not too low. It would also provide more veto power over others. September 11th gave some new pretexts. They're thin, but maybe sufficient. And the timing is kind of important, mainly for domestic reasons. It's not a secret that the administration is carrying out a major assault against the general population here. These are recycled Reaganites, and they redid very quickly what they did under Reagan. They drove the country into a huge deficit. This time the trick was a tax cut for the rich, carefully crafted so that its main effect hits after the next election. But the point is, as in Reagan's case, that it means there won't be any funds for unwanted programs, those that might be of some use to the general public instead of rich people. And that means that we have to have what's called fiscal discipline, as Alan Greenspan soberly informs us. The fiscal discipline means that tax cuts for the rich and crumbs for the rest. That's when all else fails, there's one way to rally the population. Everybody knows this, dictator, Democrat, whatever, terrifying. If you can frighten people, maybe they'll accept anything. If you can frighten them enough, it's last resort. So it's not that hard to depict Saddam Hussein as the ultimate evil about to conquer the world, maybe the universe. After all, Ronald Reagan was able to claim that Gaddafi is trying to expel America from the world, no less. So if he could do it with Gaddafi, he can do it with Saddam Hussein. Iran's probably next in line. Beyond that, many choices. Well, a lot more to say, but it's getting late. It's commonly claimed that everything has changed since September 11th. Frankly, I doubt it very much. The institutions remain stable. Policy flows from institutions. There are some variations, often important ones, but not very great. And I think if you take a close look, you find that the guiding principles remain within a very narrow spectrum. They're adapted to circumstances. They can be modified, in fact, substantially modified by organized and active popular forces. That's often happened in the past, and that's where any real hope for the future lies, at least in my opinion.